So yes, we are currently at the stage where we are here to speak about the struggles of the domestic workers, because in the past, domestic workers were not recognized to receive anything other than the unemployment insurance fund. And they would have to institute delictual actions or claims against the employer, which was very expensive and they couldn't afford it. So as a result, most of them just died off in the injustice of it. And I think more elaborately, my colleague can indicate over here as to the progress and what she has experienced. So can you please tell Johannesburg, what is the experience regarding this case?
Okay, Maria Mahlango fell in a swimming pool while cleaning the windows at her workplace in 2012, like it said. At that time when she fell into the swimming pool, the family was not compensated. The employer only gave them 5,000 rand for burial, to assist with burial. And when we went to the employer and asked them to compensate family with something, after 2 weeks he told me that he can only compensate family with 2,500 rand, because that's what Maria Mahlangu was earning at that time. So it shows that people, some employers don't care about domestic workers, and they know very well that domestic workers are not covered by COIDA. There's no law that is protecting domestic workers when coming to that, because he even said it confidently that COIDA is not working on domestic workers. The employer, Mr. Titor, said it himself there.
The employment force here, or the labor force, are domestic workers, according to the International Labour Organization. The statistics show that there is so many of these vulnerable employees. And I'm also aware that you've experienced a lot of issues relating to getting the rights of the domestic workers into the courts. And so can you just tell us about that as well?
You spoke about UIF, and as you speak, we have more than 1 million domestic workers in South Africa. Not even half of them is registered with the UIF. There's a lot that is happening behind those closed doors of the domestic workers' employers. There's sexual harassment, and sometimes they don't even report it because they know no one will bear them witness, and they don't have power to take their employers to court. So they just die silence. Others do just leave their work and go home. There's abuse verbally by the employers. Others are even forced to do work like helping a dog when it gives birth. Have you ever heard that the domestic worker is told to assist the dog to give birth by the employer who's standing there? There's a lot that is happening, a lot of injustice that is happening to domestic workers. The other domestic workers in Rhodium was made to touch the...
She thinks that it needs an amendment, the COIDA, and we need to include domestic workers. From then till now, the only thing that has been done was a bill. So that's where we are at current. Is that this bill, the whole debate around it was that they wanted to have the domestic workers in terms of provident fund actually receiving something. So they were looking at if is it feasible or not. But in that whole delay, there was so much of injustice still happening in terms of the act, COIDA Act. People couldn't, if you died at work and you were working for a private household, you were a domestic worker, you've been working there for 50 years even, or 35 years, some of them work for a long period of time. They weren't getting any justice. While these people at Parliament are sitting and arguing in the round table as to what is the feasibility on Provident Fund. And so they don't understand why we're seeking an order for retrospectivity. So I feel that yes, retrospectivity should be applicable until the Act came into, from the time the Constitution came into place, because there's a lot of injustice that have happened in the past. We need to remedy that. We cannot be silent and let these people still suffer and continue to suffer because we feel that the Act must only be amended now. It needs to apply retrospectively. But as I'm saying, there's a bill that is at the Parliament. So if the bill comes into place, retrospectivity will not be of an issue because that bill will not apply retrospectivity. Yes. So which means that we're going to have to look at the Constitutional Court giving that order so that we can have these domestic workers actually go back and exercise their rights.
Now, Ospinki, you've been in this environment, it touches you emotionally and otherwise. Your wish as an organization, what is your wish? What do you want to see?
What I want to see happening is for the government. Actually, the minister has already agreed that he will compensate domestic workers retrospectively, unlimited. So we want to see them starting with the process next year, like they said. They said next year they will be starting to register domestic workers with COIDA, and the claims, we will be able to put in claims. That's what I want to see happening. All the domestic workers who have lost their loved ones while on duty, I want to see them getting compensation. All the domestic workers who are crippled, who are physically disabled because of their related issues. I want to see them compensated. There are domestic workers who are affected by the dog's hair fur in the house because they have to vacuum them. The dogs are sleeping on the sofas, are sleeping on the beds. The domestic workers have to clean and wash those things using their hands, and they get affected. Nobody's taking responsibility. When they start to cough a lot, the employers will say, now you are very sick, you're going to make us sick, you must go home. I want to see justice.
Now, let's look at how will this actually protect both parties? Because sometimes when you talk about a whole lot of laws and all that, it goes both ways. So if this can work, the position of an employer and the position of an employee, how will that actually be better as in relationships?
Then stand in the shoes of the employer and compensate. Or even in terms of negligence, they will pay out as well. The commission will pay out. So the employer also is safeguarded in that way. But the employer also now will have to, there is going to be, according to this, the minister, in his recent publications, the Department of Labor is going to put up a specific rules and regulations regarding the registration of the employer. So the employer must register, obviously, the domestic worker, because that's the only way that we're going to keep track of these domestic workers. But this was supposed to happen some time back in terms of the Labor Relations Act. When the Labor Relations Act was amended to include these domestic workers, there was made provision in terms of the Department of Labor that there must be a coordinator or supervisor who would then, if he feels that the employer is not up to date with the laws, the labor laws of the country, he will take it to the labor court. So yes, that was something that was put into place, but I see that it's not enacted fully. So yes, the domestic workers need to be appraised of their rights. Their rights would be that in terms of labor laws, they are employees. They have all rights regarding their employment in terms of the labor laws of this country. And also now that they can claim for compensational injuries. If they sustain any injury at their workplace, if they have any sort of disease that they've contracted during the employment at their workplace, or even if the third party, while in their scope of employment, has caused such injury or death, they can claim for compensation or medical costs. It's very important. Medical costs fully paid, because medical costs is something that a domestic worker cannot survive. She cannot support herself in terms of payment of that because of her salary is so low. So yes, I think they should know that the medical costs, all other expenses are also included. As well as 75% of their pay will be paid for a period of 3 months. So yes, they will be covered by this act. So in terms of the law, this is the way forward, the regulation, that the rules must be there to say that the employer has a certain responsibility to register his employee. The employee also has certain rights and duties as well. Duties such as to fill out the forms, the commission, and so forth, and the right to review. The right to review is now granted through the court order because they're now declaring it unconstitutional. So eventually what would happen is if the commission refuses, now a domestic worker can obviously take that decision of refusal on review.
Was beaten by 6 pit bulls and he died. When I was asking the investigative officer, he said, no, it's not a South African. That was not the point. The point is that he was working in somebody's else yard, and as soon as the employer employs a domestic worker, whether it's from Malawi, whether it's from Ghana, the point that you have employed that person in South Africa, that domestic worker is covered by the labor laws of domestic workers in South Africa. So we are saying we are going to sit down the government, because even at the CCMA, we represent domestic workers from Lesotho with only passport, no work permits, because they employ them without papers, and when they fire them, they will be the first to say, she doesn't even have papers, she's illegal in the country. When you employ that person is covered by the labor laws, like I said. So we will be sitting and saying to all domestic workers in South Africa, irrespective of the country of their birth, must be compensated when they get injured. They must be included on the Compensation for Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act.
Now, Samira, we're looking at time, and we're looking at let's look at this case. There's just another postponement of some sort, whether it's because of maybe there could be, settlement out of court or whatever issue that may be. This is a landmark case. Are you happy with what has been happening in the high courts of this country? You can take the fair share of that as closing remarks.
I'm very, very happy. It's been a long journey, but really there is a light at the end of a tunnel. I can see the light. I can see justice for domestic workers, and I knew it from the beginning that we will get there.
Samira?
I just want to state from a legal point of view, I'm happy that this has went to the courts, because it seems that the parliament was taking long to legislate and enact something that would protect these domestic workers' rights. However, I feel that there must be rules that the department puts into place in terms of what is going to happen now, because we cannot just be barbarically just moving from one thing to another. We need to know, and the domestic workers need to be fully protected. And as my colleague illustrated, I feel that the domestic workers as well as cleaners in this country, whether is even in foreign nationals, have all rights in terms of the constitution. And yes, the courts will always protect those rights. So each worker needs to be advised that they have rights, whether they are illegal in this country, they are employed, as my colleague illustrated, they are employees. And employees have rights. So determining that, I would say that police officers as well should look at the law the way it is, and exercise it the way it is promulgated, because it's important that these workers can get access to their full rights in terms of the constitution, as well as in terms of all the labor laws of this country.